We're thrilled to welcome you to our first presentation this year. As you know, we on the special events group at Encore Learning really work hard to present to you interesting presentations, varied presentations, presentations by people that are real authorities in their field. And you will not be disappointed today for our kickoff presentation for 2022. John Burgess is our presenter today, and he will be talking about his book and his experiences in exploring Angkor Wat and the temples of Angkor over in Cambodia. We think that probably a lot of you might have been there, because I know we in Encore Learning are a fairly well-traveled group. John lived in Bangkok and numerous places, New Delhi, Jakarta, and then eventually Washington, D.C. when he was a youth. His father was a diplomat, so he really had quite a childhood living in the international arena there. He became interested in that area and actually became a journalist and worked for the Bangkok World and eventually other publications in Asia. And eventually then worked in 1980, started to work for the Washington Post in assignments in Japan and Korea. Actually, he was stationed at Japan, covering Japan and Korea for quite a while, and then eventually came back to Washington and was the first technology editor at the Washington Post. He had a 30-year career at the Post, so he's quite well known in the Washington area for his writing up with the Post. He's written numerous books on Angkor Wat, actually numerous historical fiction and nonfiction books, and this is one of his nonfiction books. So without further ado, I am absolutely thrilled to introduce John Burgess to talk to us about Angkor Wat and the history and the current situation there. John?
Okay. Louise, thanks very much for that very kind introduction. Give me a second. I'm going to share my screen now. And here we go. Now, in this country, I'm always surprised at how we all grow up with some basic knowledge about ancient Rome, Egypt, even ancient China. We see them in books and movies. We get some basic study about them in school. And it's amazing to me to think that we're so unaware of another great civilization, one that dominated much of Southeast Asia for 6 centuries and left us with some of the most astounding, most beautiful architecture and art on the face of the globe. Now, as you know, I'm talking about the civilization known as Angkor. Its dates are roughly 800 AD to 1450 AD. It was a Hindu and Buddhist civilization, adopting language, culture, and customs from India, but then blending them with local ways to come up with a unique culture that we now call Khmer culture. So let me tell you a bit about the temples, their culture and history, and then we'll move to the subject of my new book, The Temples' Modern History, for things like this. This is a scene from 1873 when the French had first arrived to do a formal sort of evaluation, technical survey of the temples, and also carried off a lot of sculpture that ended up back in Paris, where you can still see it today. Now, I was lucky, unusual among Americans, in that I got an early exposure to Angkor. It was 1969, and I was a teenager. My family at the time was living in Bangkok, where my father was director of the UNICEF program. I think it was in August that year, 1969, that my mother and I flew to Angkor and spent 2 or 3 days there. Now, I have no photographs, no letters or souvenir air ticket from that visit. I wish I did, but what I have is tremendous memories. I was immediately enchanted, overwhelmed with the place. It had everything, I thought: astounding architecture, great history with conqueror kings, armies on the march. And it also had a deep spiritual context, which even at that early age, I think it made an impression on me. Basically, I never forgot the place and was able to return to it many times later in life and write books about it. So let me run through a little history here. Here are the Khmer Empire's geographic bounds, its high point in the 12th century. As you can see, it took in almost all of present-day Cambodia, large parts of Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. And I'll run you through a few photographs to give you an idea of the place. Now, Angkor is a collection of temples, of which the largest has a similar name, Angkor Wat. That was the temple that you saw on my opening slide. But Angkor is better thought of as a city, like Rome, capital of a great empire for roughly 6 centuries, and with a culture and a heritage that continues to influence modern life in the countries around it. This is a satellite image and will give you an idea of the enormous scale of the place. The long rectangle on the left part of the screen with the blue is a reservoir. It measures roughly 5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. The square at the middle is the walls of an ancient walled city known as Angkor Thom. And the other square that you see below that is the moats of Angkor Wat. You'll notice that everything except the airport runway, which is to the bottom left, runs in a strict east-west, north-south orientation, which was very important to the Khmers whenever they built things. So let me show you a few of the temples of the Angkor period. This is actually a rather small one by Angkor standards. It's called Phnom Krom, and it has 3 towers honoring the Hindu trinity of Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. It's located atop a hill alongside the Tonle Sap, which is the Great Lake of central Cambodia. The hill itself is sort of a giant block of sandstone, and the stone for this temple was quarried right on the site. Parts of the temple underfoot are what they call living stone, stones left in their original place and incorporated into the temple. This is a huge complex known as Bante Chamar. It's away from the main Angkor group, and it remains, as you can see, in near total disrepair. This is another temple, Bang Malia. Very little is known of its history, except that it seems to have been built at the same time as Angkor Wat because the two share many similar elements of style. This is the famous Bayonne temple. It's the one that has the famous face towers of faces facing in the 4 cardinal direction with this mysterious smile. Here's a close-up of one of those faces. And now Angkor has a lot of temples, but it also has other things that ancient cities have. For instance, city gates. This is one of 5 processional entrances to the walled city Angkor Thom, and you can see it's topped by face towers. And that central entrance is basically tall enough for an elephant with riders on top of it to fit through. It has bridges on a road system that held the empire together. It has places for bathing. This is a giant bathing pool that was located inside the compound that used to contain the royal palace. The palace itself has long since been lost because it, like all other houses in Angkor, was made of wood and just has been lost to the elements over the years. And some of the most beautiful sights of Angkor are its waters, its moats, its canals, its reservoirs. And, you know, it would be easy to talk for a whole hour about what is known as the hydraulic system of Angkor. This very complex system of canals, reservoirs, rivers, channels under walls that collects waters from highlands and moves it down and then around the region and eventually into the Tonle Sap, the Great Lake. And there are people who say that the hydraulic system is every bit as amazing as the temples. Now, of course, there were people in Angkor, and the fact is we can see many of them now in these truly remarkable bas-reliefs that depict daily life in the 12th century. And it can be fun to try to guess what's going on in scenes like this. Probably not a manicure, more likely a fortune being told of a young couple who's sitting there on the right. And here we see servants rushing around. It looks like preparing some kind of banquet and loading food onto trays to be served for a scene. Down at the bottom, you can see a man tending the fire beneath a giant vat. Now, you can also see the aristocracy of the times. This is one of the Khmer Empire's greatest kings, Suryavarman II is his name. He was on the throne roughly for the first half of the 12th century, and his great creation is Angkor Wat. And this is a bas-relief of him sitting on his royal dais inside Angkor Wat itself. He's attended by all of these courtiers who are both fanning him and holding ceremonial symbolic parasols over his head, which indicate his rank. There are also scenes of the many battles that were fought during the empire, and here we see Khmer soldiers advancing into battle with their spears at the ready and a war elephant behind them. Now, like with all great empires, Angkor peaked, and its last great burst of construction took place in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The Bayonne and the walls of Angkor Thom are among the creations of that last burst of construction. And after that, the empire began coasting, living off its capital. Nothing much more was built. It was squeezed militarily by Siam on the west and Vietnam on the east. And perhaps in the 15th century, a remarkable and still only vaguely understood process begins. The Khmers start to abandon Angkor. It's a very slow process, but over time, most of the temples are essentially turned over to nature. The royal court moves to the east, to the region where the current capital, Phnom Penh, is today. Many of the people go too, but others stay and continue to farm the lands around the temples. There's no written record about why this happened, and so there's been endless theorizing in the academic world about how the Khmers could simply turn their backs and walk away from such an incredible creation. But there are lots of theories: military pressure, change of religion, droughts, new trading patterns, breakdown of this hydraulic system, and a phenomenon that academics call social exhaustion, meaning that people could just no longer muster the enormous labor and devotion that was needed to keep all of these places running. But I'd say that today the consensus view stresses environmental issues. 2 years-long droughts have been documented at right around the time that the abandonment was taking place. There are signs of the hydraulic system breaking down and being repaired in a hurry. But again, it's still something that there will be a debate continuing on for years. So that is Angkor's history in a nutshell, but my book, my new book, begins after all of this. It's about what comes next, about how Angkor fares in the modern age. And I define that as the French colonial period beginning in the 1860s up to the present day. In the 1860s, the French begin taking an interest in Cambodia. The posthumous publication of the journal and sketches of a French naturalist named Henri Mouot, here he is, reintroduces Angkor to the world, published first in 1863 in Paris. And that's the same year that Cambodia becomes a French protectorate, and beginning what will turn out to be an almost century-long run as a French colony. French archaeologists, conservators, and a lot of amateurs arrive, and they begin the process of trying to preserve the temples, essentially protect them from the forces of nature. And this is work that continues up to the present day. Here you see an etching of early work on the Bayonne temple. And just down there at the lower left, you can see there's a Frenchman sitting there supervising. Got a pointer here. That's the Frenchman in the photograph. And he is basically supervising a lot of Cambodian laborers who are clearing a tree trunk and trying to get an idea of what Angkor, of what this temple looked at. One of the problems was you couldn't get a proper view of the temples because there was so much vegetation around them. Now, in the 1930s, the French moved to a new approach, which was to actually disassemble and rebuild some of these temples. And this was first done on a major basis with a temple called Bante Sre. It was relatively small, and so a good place to experiment and try this system. And essentially, it involved literally disassembling the whole thing, keeping painstaking records about what went where, replacing stones that were lost or had eroded or become broken, and then putting down modern foundations, concrete, and putting the whole thing back together. And so, as you can see, this temple is in excellent condition, but it didn't make it to the 20th century in this state. It was rebuilt. Now, the French also set out to try to restore the lost history of Angkor. When they arrived, the local people could basically not tell them anything about how old were these places, what were their history, and even such simple questions as basic questions as what was the sequence of construction of the different temples. Some of the people told Henri Mouot, that French naturalist who was the first one there, that the angels had built it, or it had built itself. But the Khmers had left behind some evidence of what was the history of these places, and that is inscriptions that were carved into the stone at many of the temples. Mouot saw a few of these and called them, quote, a sealed book for want of an interpreter, and they may perchance throw light on the subject when some European savant shall succeed in deciphering them. So over time, something close to 1,500 of these inscriptions were found in various temples and in various states of preservation, some of them like this one, almost perfectly preserved, and some of them, for the most part, lost, and just presenting a few words to try to decipher. They were variously written in Sanskrit, which is the language of Hinduism, functioning, in some ways in a similar way as Latin has in the Catholic Church over the years. And other inscriptions were in what's known today as Old Khmer, which was essentially the lingua franca of the day, the market language, using a script phonetically adopted from Sanskrit. So the French set about to try to start reading these things and combine the knowledge from these 1,500 different inscriptions to come up with a basic history of the place. And it was no easy task, especially since these inscriptions are very ceremonial. They're often a lot about religion and praise to the Hindu or the Buddhist pantheon. But by working over time, these linguists were able to reassemble the basic history that around the year 800, a founding king had undergone religious rituals that created an empire, and that around the year 900, Angkor was established as the capital, that the empire consisted of a series of estates on land awarded by the king to loyal supporters, that Hinduism was the state religion for much of the time, but that Buddhism often coexisted with it, and toward the end of the empire became the official state religion. And that in the 12th century, a rival state based in Vietnam actually conquered Angkor, and then was driven out by a great king, Jayavarman VII is his name, who began that last great burst of construction that I mentioned earlier. Now, I'll just read you a few quotes from these inscriptions. One of my books, my first book, as a matter of fact, is all about inscriptions, so I've had quite an interest in them. But the most important inscription of all is one from a place called Sidok Kok Tom. And here are a few quotes from that. It begins with a very religious approach. It says, "Praise be to Shiva." Now, Shiva was the god to whom this temple, Sidok Kok Tom, was dedicated, "whose nature is proclaimed wordlessly, yet thunderously, by the subtle soul life of his body, which reaches everywhere and quickens the senses of all living beings." This is in verse, and it's quite poetic stuff, even in translation. Then later on, it gets around to talking about the king who was on the throne at the time. And it says, "There was once a sovereign of the world, whose feet were clasped by all kings, whose part it was to cause the hearts of men to unfold as lotuses, who dispelled all gloom, and who, by reason of his splendor, was named Udayaditya," which means sunrise, light, a name that has connotations of lighting the world. This was the king who, it says, dispelled all gloom, who caused the hearts of men to unfold as lotuses. In other words, he was the spiritual leader. He was the father of the nation who caused his empire to prosper. Now, these inscriptions are also very, very detailed when it comes to real estate. And sometimes they can read like real estate documents at a courthouse in the United States. And some of the inscriptions were created for the purpose of documenting a sale of land. And they will lay out in detail what was paid for the land and then give a description of the metes and bounds of the land, as they say. So here's from this same inscription, a description of a purchase of land, and it says, "Given in exchange for the purchase were 2 taels of gold, 320 lower garments, 1 yao of cloth, 4 goats, 4 sacred cows, and 12 water buffaloes. Metes and bounds of the land in the settlement, together with the rice land to the north, colon. On the east, it abuts on land of Danavaha. Of the south, it extends to Danan. On the west, it extends to the ox cart road west of Snaval. On the north, it runs to the paddy burning ground, turns and reaches back to the bank of the reservoir, and on the east, again, it extends to the sacred Margosa tree." So you can really see how similar this is to a modern real estate document. And it's very interesting. From inscriptions like this, we know that the Khmers did not have a currency, and the economy was conducted on a barter basis. And I've always wondered how the people in transactions like this went about deciding the exact price. Why not 6 sacred cows rather than 4 sacred cows? Anyway, information from inscriptions and bas-relief scenes was combined with accounts from Chinese travelers, one in particular who came in the 13th century and left a very detailed account of everyday life in Angkor. And finally, there was archaeological evidence from surveys and excavations. This all came together to give us this basic understanding of what we know today. But it's still a very thin record compared to what we know about, say, ancient Rome. There's no Plutarch, there's no speeches of Cicero, nothing like that. Basically just these inscriptions and Chinese accounts. Now, the conservation work and the historical work that the French did was part of France's justification for colonial rule of Cambodia, to show that this great architectural treasure of all humankind was in good hands. So they worked to get lots of publicity for that. They sold major pieces of Khmer art to museums all over the world. The Met in New York was one of them, and it purchased a trove of high quality statuary in 1936. Now, the French also worked to bring in tourists to see the place with their own eyes. And by 1910 or so, they were selling package tours. Excuse me. The target customers were wealthy Westerners who in those days would take months-long, even years-long foreign tours. And I should say adventurous wealthy tourists, because getting to Angkor was quite a slog. From Phnom Penh, a steamboat took you for 200 miles to a place where you transferred to a sampan and then to an ox cart, and you made your way north to this place, right across from the main entrance of Angkor Wat. It was called the Bungalow, and it was Angkor's first tourist hotel, opening in 1909. At first, it had just 10 rooms, 14 beds, a salon, and a dining room. Tourists would walk or ride on these special little ox carts that you see there in the foreground, known as norgalettes, and promoted as being more comfortable than the traditional farm ox carts. So tourists did the temples during the day. Here you see two Western men on the left with their sun hats sitting and having a picnic lunch at the temple called Preah Khan. At night, and you can see there are 3 Cambodians with them, and a couple of gods are sitting in on this lunch. So they did the temples by day and then came back to the bungalow and had something resembling a French dinner and even ice cream on the days after the steamboat arrived. And were Model T Fords to pick them up from the steamer later on, and later on performances of classical dance. Now, one of the visitors in the 1920s was an American woman named Helen Churchill Candy. That's her on the left, and her son on top of an elephant out in front of Angkor Wat. And world travel was nothing unusual for her. 10 years earlier, she had sailed on the Titanic and was one of the survivors who got places on the lifeboats. She arrived at Angkor by steamboat in 1922. And later, she wrote a delightful book called Angkor the Magnificent that was important in opening the eyes of the Western English-speaking world about Angkor. It was recently published by a publisher called Date Asia, excuse me. Anyway, her steamboat arrived near Angkor at night, and in the darkness, she and other passengers stepped down the sampans to go ashore. And for reasons we can only guess, she didn't remark on how this must have felt similar to her experience on the Titanic, getting onto a small boat in a strange place at night. She was a very respectful observer of the ancient culture and present-day culture, and presented her readers with descriptions and impressions of all the major temples. I like in particular her description of the Devata, these carved celestial women who occur by the hundreds in Angkor Wat. Here's one of them. Candy wrote, quote, "I am made shy in their presence while they remain unperturbed. There are so many to know all at once, and their character to me is unfathomable. Coming into the court where they abound is like coming into a room full of living strangers. They have the ease of those to whom self-consciousness is unknown, the air of the rich aristocrat." She also gives us a sign that tourism was not as well organized as it might have been. One day, the manager of the bungalow came to the people who were staying there and announced that another boatload of people was coming. And even though the hotel was already full, everyone would have to double up to make room for the newcomers. But when the newcomers arrived, they were outraged that they had to double up. And so they protested, "Impossible. I cannot sleep two in a room, unbearable." Those were the kind of protests they made, but they didn't win out because the bungalow was the only place to stay. Now, sometime in the 1920s, the French began bringing tourists in by air, by seaplanes, and actually landing them right there in the moat of Angkor Wat. You can imagine what a sight that must have been to local people and their worries about disturbing the spirits of that inhabited all of these places. But here you see a plane that's tied up actually right in front of the bungalow, and I think that's the pilot sitting down and three proud tourists facing us standing up. Now, later on, a large hotel known as the Grand Hotel opened in 1932 to bring something closer to Western tourist luxury to the place. And if you stayed, you might well have gone away with a suitcase decal like this. That's Angkor Wat at the top, and on the lower left is the Grand Hotel. And at the lower right is the bungalow, which had been given a new name, Hotel des Ruines, a more romantic name, I imagine, to attract more people. Now, one of the reasons, and Angkor was also getting a few very famous people coming to visit at this point. In 1936, Charlie Chaplin and Paulette Goddard, the reigning Hollywood stars of the time, came to Angkor. They were in the middle of a 6-month tour of Asia. They were greeted by the media at every stop, and the local French at Angkor, of course, turned out to give them personalized tours. And the strange thing is that the temples seem not to have made much of an impression on Chaplin. In the 60s, he published this very thick autobiography in which he makes no mention of Angkor or even Cambodia. Now, one of the reasons for tourism was to generate foreign exchange, but there was also this effort to introduce Angkor to the world and to show the world that France was taking good care of these places. And so they wanted lots of foreign witnesses who would see this and go back and spread the word in their home countries, spend some money, and maybe donate some money to the upkeep of the place. And along the way, Angkor was being transformed into a symbol of Cambodian national pride. And this also was in part the work of the French, who felt that their presence was saving a kingdom that had grown decadent. They love that word. And they were making it again vital and glorious. They put Angkor on currency, on postage stamps, and on the colonial Cambodian flag. They wanted Cambodia to be a proud modern kingdom as part of the French family of colonies, of course. And this effort worked to create a great national symbol. Angkor would forever be the great gem of national pride and appear on the national flag no matter what kind of government was in power. Now, I should tell you that while foreigners were coming, so were Cambodians, and not as tourists. Here you see the King of Cambodia visiting in 1909, and this was a watercolor by a French artist. The king is the man directly beneath the parasol, and you can see two French officials in their formal white uniforms standing there with him. He came for religious and political ceremonies, but a lot of ordinary people came also, because Angkor was a great site for pilgrimages within the country. And here you see, sometime early in the 20th century, a collection of 4 women who have come to Angkor as pilgrims, and actually ended up on a postcard at the time. That's where I got this image. Now, as World War II approached, Angkor was in peril. In 1941, Thailand fought a brief war with the French in Indochina to get back 3 provinces of Cambodia that the French had forcibly taken from them in 1907. These provinces included Angkor. Thai airplanes actually bombed Siem Reap, which is the town that's right next door to the temples. Luckily, they did not bomb the temples themselves, though the one temple from the Angkor era that's actually in the town suffered some minor damage from this bombing. The Thais invaded, and the Japanese then stepped in and forced negotiations between the French and the Thais. There was a treaty negotiated in Tokyo with the French feeling under duress, and they eventually gave up those 3 provinces. However, as a sort of consolation prize, they were allowed to keep Angkor itself, and the new border between Thailand and Cambodia was drawn literally to run only a few hundred yards from the main Angkor group. Pretty soon, Japanese troops were coming into Angkor. This was the months right before Pearl Harbor. They were there in an agreement with the French colonial authorities. And by the week before Pearl Harbor, there were roughly 1,400 Japanese in Siem Reap and Angkor, with the French worrying that the Japanese troops were not properly respecting the temples, driving their trucks too fast near the temples. Then came Pearl Harbor, and Pearl Harbor was followed by a series of invasions around Southeast Asia, in which essentially the whole region erupted in war. But this larger war was good luck for Angkor, because it meant that almost all of the Japanese who had been at Angkor left. They crossed into Thailand, and from there presumably continued south into Malaya and to fight the British. Angkor basically rode out World War II without ever getting in the way of hostilities. The French remained in control until the very end of the war, when the Japanese who were there essentially staged a coup d'etat against them. Here are a few of the Japanese troops. This is one of the very few photographs that I've ever seen of the Japanese at Angkor during the war. You can see a number of soldiers are climbing. These are the steps of Angkor Wat, and the soldier in front is carrying a Japanese flag. This was published in a Japanese newspaper with accompanying stories about how these great temples were now under the protection of the Japanese Imperial Army. So Angkor got through World War II with no problem, but then in 1946, the French came back and reestablished colonial control, and an independence guerrilla movement had arisen. And in 1946, there was a concerted attack against French houses, French facilities in Siem Reap itself, in which a number of French were killed, and that these guerrillas laid siege actually to the Grand Hotel, which had become a convalescence center for French military people. The French were able eventually to respond and drive the guerrillas out of Siem Reap, but the guerrillas actually retreated to Angkor and took over Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom. The French followed them there, and in a not very long exchange of fire, fought their way into Angkor Wat and left hundreds of bullet holes on the eastern entranceway of Angkor Wat. So, as I say, it made it it made it through World War II fine, but the independence struggle that began in Cambodia resulted in the French shooting up Angkor, and we are told that they purposely did not use heavy weapons. But anyway, Angkor, Cambodia achieved independence in early 1950s, and there began sort of a golden age of peace, tranquility, and tourism at Angkor. This was a period of tranquility in most of Cambodia. You may remember the name Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who was an autocrat who was in charge of Cambodia through the 50s and 60s. Tourism reopened, but it was on a very small scale. This is a photograph that my father took actually in 1969, and you can see there's almost no one at Angkor Wat. We're looking down the main processional avenue. Now, in 1967, Angkor got a visit from someone who was arguably the most famous woman in the world, Jackie Kennedy. It was, in theory, a totally private visit, fulfilling, she said, of a lifelong dream to see Angkor. But it ended up having all the trappings of a state visit. The United States hoped that Jackie would bring Prince Sihanouk toward the American side in the Vietnam War, which was raging at its height right next door. And Sihanouk was charmed by her, entertained her at formal dinners with toasts and wine. And in fact, many historians credit this visit for helping persuade Sihanouk to reopen diplomatic relations with the United States. But when you publish a book of nonfiction, you always discover things right afterwards that you wish you had known and had put in the book. And for my book, one of those things that I learned too late is that Jackie Kennedy, in fact, did have sort of a personal connection to Angkor. As a high school student, when she was studying French, she had translated from French to English a book that's today often known by the title, A Record of Cambodia. And that was the account that I mentioned earlier, the Chinese traveler's account from the 13th century. And it includes all sorts of fascinating details about life, a detailed description of the king riding in royal procession with the ladies of the court carrying candles even in daylight, that people awoke in the middle of the night in the hot season to take baths to cool off, that there were prostitutes working the markets. So it's not a long book, but that must have been quite an undertaking if Jackie Kennedy published the whole thing, and she would have been one of the rare people at the time in the United States who even knew about that book. And the visit also had some interesting overlaps in her private life. She was accompanied on the trip by David Ormsby Gore, who had been the British ambassador to the United States during the Kennedy administration. He was known at the time to be courting her. And a few years ago, his children discovered letters in the attic at, I guess, the family country estate, dating to a few months after the visit to Cambodia. And they, what did they do? But they put the letters up for auction, and they sold. And so we know what was in those letters. And in them, she basically, in one of them, she turns down his offer of marriage. And as you know, she went on to marry Aristotle Onassis. Now, in 1970, things turned tragic for Angkor and for Cambodia at large. Cambodia is essentially engulfed in the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese and the Khmer Rouge take over almost all of the country, with the exception of major provincial, the capital and major provincial towns, and they take over Angkor. In 1970, they just roll in, and the government soldiers roll out. Here we see some Khmer Rouge foot soldiers marching inside the walls of Angkor Wat. From 1970 going forward, Angkor was largely off limits to the outside world. Really, the only good news for this period was that, for the most part, hostilities stayed away. The US Air Force never bombed in Angkor. There were a few clashes, a few shellings, but for the most part, the temples were not threatened by guns and bombs. What they were threatened by was neglect. Conservation work stopped. Trees and grass and vines moved back in. So did the bats, who were under the impression that the chambers inside the temples were actually caves. Concerning the people living in the area, the conservation workers and the thousands who lived there as farmers, for them, the warriors was an absolute catastrophe. In 1975, when the Khmer Rouge won full victory, people in the area were packed off to communes in the area and essentially put to work as enslaved labor. That was the pattern all over Cambodia. In 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge, but the government that they installed was boycotted by most of the world for years. And a new phase of Cambodia's war began with the remnants of the Khmer Rouge and other groups fighting the new government in Phnom Penh. Again, this meant trouble for Angkor Temples, more neglect, but also essentially open season on theft of artwork. The lawlessness that prevailed in this period made it very easy for thieves just to come in, hack off things, take them to Thailand, and sell them. I was there as a journalist in 1980, and saw with my own eyes how little was being done to preserve the temples. This sweeper inside Angkor Wat was one of the few people I ran into keeping the place going. It wasn't until 1991, when the different factions signed a peace agreement, that things began to look up for the temples. International groups returned and began funding conservation, archaeology. Angkor became an official UNESCO World Heritage Site, under which Cambodia received large amounts of conservation help and had to agree to certain conditions of how the place would be maintained, protected from development. By the beginning of the 2000s, tourism was getting up a real head of steam. Hundreds of hotels and guest houses were being built in Siem Reap to accommodate a trade that just kept growing and growing. At the height of tourism in the 1960s, about 50,000 foreigners a year were visiting. In the year 2013, the number topped 2 million foreigners per year coming. And Cambodia was doing everything it could to get the numbers up, because tourism was one of the few ways in which it earned foreign exchange. So scenes like this began to be common. The tourist masses introduced a whole new set of questions. Idling tour buses pumping out diesel fumes, thousands and thousands of pairs of feet crossing very soft sandstone and wearing it down. There was even concern that the amount of water that was going to maintain and entertain these tourists, the swimming pools, the showers, the ornamental ponds, was lowering the water table in the area with potential long-term settling danger to the foundations of the temple. And what about the dignity of these places that had been built as sacred houses of worship, and the vandalism that always comes when you let large numbers of people on holiday in some way? A few travel companies began advising their clients to give Angkor a miss for the time being. But Angkor remained and remains a place of intense pride for the Cambodian people. As I said, it had become the symbol of the Cambodian nation, appearing on postage stamps, currency, and again, the flag. Cambodians continued to come in large numbers. Some of them got married at Angkor. Here you can see a couple posing on the left at Angkor Wat, while a couple of tourists on the right look on. Then along came COVID in 2020, and almost overnight, Cambodia sealed itself off from the outside world. The tourist trade stopped overnight. This caused enormous economic hardship for the people of Siem Reap, who had bet their futures, the education of their children, the purchase of houses, all of these things on tourism continuing, and it ended overnight. Very painful time. But now Angkor is opening up again. Cambodia is letting vaccinated tourists in without quarantine, and the tourist trade is slowly restarting. It's been suggested that Cambodia should use the COVID pause to rethink how it does tourism, to perhaps spread people out more widely, limit the places where tourists can go, encourage them to go places other than Angkor. There's a lot more in Cambodia than the temples. And during the COVID pause, the government did take the opportunity to do some long overdue infrastructural upgrading in Siem Reap of the roads, the sidewalks. It built a bicycle trail, separate bicycle trail out to the temples from Angkor. But in a country that's as poor as Angkor, as Cambodia, people will have a hard time resisting the temptation to get the numbers back up as fast as they can. So we will be watching as Angkor is reintroduced to the world. And we've come to the end of my talk, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
John, thank you for that excellent presentation. Having been to Angkor Wat, I was really interested in it, and to hear the perspective on it. It's so easy to get into the tourist piece of it versus the history and what it's about. So thank you very much on that.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
The first question is from Claire and John. Is the Khmer alphabet related to any other? The writing, the alphabet.
Well, it's derived from Sanskrit, and the Thai and Lao alphabets are also derived from Sanskrit. So yes, it's one of the many things that Cambodia adopted from India is an adopted writing system.
The next question is, why were the temples built pointed in one direction? Was it for religious reasons or astrologically based?
Yes, religious, astrology, different gods had different orientations. The god Vishnu is normally associated with the West, and therefore Angkor Wat, a temple associated with Vishnu, faces to the West. Shiva, to whom most of the temples in Angkor are dedicated, is more associated with the East, and he would, so his temples face to the east. But there has been a lot of work over the years about orientation and how these temples are orientated for in astrology. And so one of a very popular activity is to go to Angkor Wat during the summer solstice and to see the towers come up. Excuse me, the solstice or the equinox, I get it mixed up. See the temples, the sun rise right over the central tower of Angkor Wat.
So were the temples, my question to you, were the temples designed to address the solstice? You know, as in Egypt, you know, there's certain angles that come up based on.
Well, it's believed that Angkor Wat at least was, and they almost all of them have this very rigid north, south, east, west orientation.
Gotcha. Are the inscriptions carved on stone tablets or on clay, or what are the inscriptions?
They're carved on stone, and sometimes they're carved in doorways, on door jambs. You walk through a door and you look to the left or you look to the right, and there's an inscription covering the stone of that doorway. Other times they are carved on freestanding stones, which are monoliths and, you know, look like miniature Washington monuments. Other times they're carved on bas-reliefs. The Angkor Wat bas-reliefs often have carved identifiers on. If a particular general is being depicted, there will actually be a name carved into the stone. But all of them are in stone, which is the reason they survive. Day-to-day records in Angkor, it's believed, were kept on palm leaf. And you can imagine how many, you know, a great mass of records that must have been generated, say, by building Angkor Wat. Records of the design, of the supply of building materials, of the wages paid to people, all of that gone. The only thing that survives is these inscriptions carved in stone concerning written records left behind by the Khmers themselves.
Gotcha. The next question is, what are some of the reasons given as to why people suddenly disappeared from their advanced civilizations, much like ancient cultures around the world? A subject of great study and speculation. In 1431, the Siamese actually captured Angkor, and early on, people thought, well, it was a military question. The court wanted to move further away from their enemy, Siam. There were also questions of a breakdown of the water system on which so much depended for flood control, possibly for the irrigation of fields. The religion shifted from Hinduism initially to Mahayana Buddhism and then to Theravada Buddhism. But there was a theory that Buddhism did not require these huge temples, the building of huge temples. It was more of a personal faith. Another theory has it that the Khmers wanted to be closer to trading routes, because if you look on a map, you'll see that Angkor is really sort of at the end of a dead-end road, an alley with no exit. And by moving east, they were closer to the Mekong and closer to the trade with China and with India. So all of these theories have sort of run hot and cold over the years. I would say in the last 10 to 20 years, the scholarship is tending to favor the environmental reason as being a real driver. They have documented two sort of like
10 to 20-year droughts that occurred right at the time when Angkor was being abandoned. And a drought would obviously have make the existing hydraulic system non-functional or only semi-functional if it's suddenly only getting half of the water that it used to. And at the same time, there is new archaeological evidence of sort of breakdowns of that water system and sort of haphazard repair to them. But it will forever, the short answer is it will forever remain a mystery. You go to these places and you wonder, how could people ever turn their backs on this place? And there was, in fact, one Cambodian king from the period when the capital had moved to the Phnom Penh area who tried to actually move back. And this was, I believe, in the mid-16th century. And, assign thousands of people to clear vegetation and make these places usable again. But after a while, that effort was abandoned and the court moved back to where it had been. But that's the boiling down of years and years of scholarship.
Gotcha. Next question by C.J. Collins is there an airport at Siem Reap?
Yes, there is an airport. You could see it on that satellite image. It was the one diagonal. It was the one sort of landmark viewable from space, which was not on a east-west, north-south orientation. So there is an airport. It was built by the French, opened in 1932. And at present, a much larger airport with potentially 10 times the capacity is being built, a half an hour away from Siem Reap, and that at some point is going to take over the tourist trade.
By the way, having been there, it was a big deal. Tourists, your picture was accurate the time when I was there. There were just tons of people, just tons. So it was quite something. Esther Williams asked the question, what is Cambodia doing to prevent any future destruction of these historic sites? She said from the Taliban. The Taliban wasn't there. That's just, did you say?
No, well.
Okay. What are they doing to protect?
Well, the Khmer Rouge controlled Angkor for 10 years. And while they made war on Buddhism, on contemporary religion, and destroyed temples and executed monks, they tended to view the ancient temples as proof of the glories of the Khmer race. They did not engage in destruction of the Khmer, of the Angkor era temples. There's no evidence that there was any kind of systematic looting of artwork from the temples during the Khmer Rouge period. What they did was neglect them, and vegetation moves into these places almost instantly if it's not held in check. So the Khmer Rouge were driven from power in early 1979. So at present, art theft has pretty much been brought under control. It's mainly a problem when some brand new site out in the hinterland is discovered and local people find out about it and go digging there in hopes that they'll unearth something that would have value on an underground art market. But the wholesale looting of Khmer art treasures is over. Under UNESCO and under agreements with a lot of foreign countries, there are very elaborate conservation programs in place to maintain and repair and sometimes rebuild entire sections of these temples. The United States has funded conservation work at a temple called Phnom Bakeng, for instance. but there's always this pressure, this balance between tourism and conservation. You know, ideally for conservation, there would be no tourists. And ideally for tourism, there would be no controls. And tourists would be able to go anywhere at all times. And so there's always a compromise being worked out. And the conservation people would like to see greater controls over tourism. Fewer sets of feet, going up ancient stairways, which are, sandstone is really not a very strong stone, and it erodes, it wears away if people are walking up and down it all the time. But when you go to Angkor, I'm sure you had this experience, you're surprised that you can go almost anywhere in the temples. There's very little that's like roped off
Right.
from you. And those great bas-reliefs are not covered. And, most people are respectful, but you can imagine a lot of people want to put their hands out and touch and feel these great works of art. So for the past 2 years, there have been almost zero foreign tourists. The only foreign tourists at Angkor in the past 2 years have been expatriates, foreigners who live in Cambodia. Cambodians have been able to come most of the time when there weren't COVID restrictions on traveling between provinces. But now tourism is beginning, and so we'll see how it develops.
I have a question for you, but let me just finish that question. They also related to preserving the temples. Are the neighboring Asian countries contributing all to that? And is the U.S. or UNESCO, or is there other money coming in to help restore them?
I don't know that, Thailand and Vietnam, Laos, I don't know that they're actually, funding conservation work in Angkor. They have their own antiquities to take care of. Most of the money is from UNESCO and industrial world governments and nonprofits, groups that specialize in helping preserve ancient architecture.
So of course, everybody loves that picture of Jackie sitting there. So questions are, who are the other people in that picture?
Oh, well, one of them is her suitor.
Okay.
Let's see if the man on the far left is a man named Bernard Philippe Grolier, who was the French conservator of Angkor, the head honcho of conservation of Angkor at the time. And then there's Jackie, and then there's David Ormsby Gore, and I think there's a fourth person in that photograph who was not identified.
Okay, good, thank you. Amy asks, what are your thoughts about the Chinese ownership of many of the new mega hotels in Siem Reap, and China reaping most of the economic benefit of those hotels?
Yeah, well, this is a huge issue for Cambodia is becoming closer and closer to China, and one of the ways it does that is through these economic relations. Chinese companies are investing all over Cambodia. A Chinese company is actually building that new airport and will operate it for 45 years or something. And in Siem Reap, a lot of the tourist infrastructure is owned by Chinese companies. And this is a problem among many Cambodians because they feel that Chinese tourists come there, they stay at a Chinese hotel, they ride in a Chinese bus, the Chinese tour operator, and basically most of the benefit is going to some Chinese company and leaving the country. And this is one of the main one of the main economic challenges of Cambodia, that it has this great site that the whole world wants to see. And it's almost like having oil in that tourists come, they spend their money year after year. There's relatively little effort on the Cambodian part other than building hotels and restaurants and roads. But so little of the economic gain from that accrues to local people. And if you go outside of Siem Reap, you know, sometimes it can seem like the war ended yesterday. Now, this has changed somewhat, but there's a tremendous disparity in Cambodia of incomes, and so much of the benefit of the gain from tourism in Cambodia goes to elite families in Cambodia or leaves the country to foreign companies. But Cambodia does have a rapid rate of economic growth, and slowly we're starting to see some gains to ordinary people, but it's been slow.
By the way, the Chinese being in there, has there been an accompanying explosion of Chinese tourists there too?
Oh yes,
disproportionately.
Prior to 2020, Chinese were the biggest national group coming to Angkor.
Carol Ann Linder asked, please discuss the architecture of the temples and what influenced the structure and style.
Right. Well, the basic design of an Angkor temple it's known as a mountain temple. The basic design is derived from India, where you can see similarly designed temples in southern India in particular. And the temple symbolizes Mount Meru, which is in Hindu mythology is a magical mountain in the Himalayas where the gods live. And the mountain has 5 peaks. A lot of these temples have 5 towers symbolizing those 5 peaks. And then Mount Meru is surrounded by the ocean, the sea of creation. And that is symbolized by the moats and the ponds that these temples always also have. Angkor Wat is surrounded by a very wide moat, and you can see it as a moat, or you can also see it as Angkor Wat floating on the sea of creation. That the moat symbolizes the sea of creation. The usual religious activity in these temples centered on the tending of a linga in the central tower of the temple. And the linga is a shaft said to have phallic connotations. It symbolizes Shiva and the power of Shiva. And the essential, typically the linga is in a very small chamber inside the central tower and is tended only by very high-ranking priests, and presumably royalty might come in also. And the basic ritual is pouring water or milk over the linga and then collecting that milk, which becomes sanctified by having flowed over the linga, and then maybe farming out that milk, that water, as sanctified, holy water or milk, and that might be taken outside of the temples and be used in other rituals. So almost all of these temples have that basic symbolism to them. The interesting thing is how dramatically the style evolved over the 6 centuries that the Khmers were building, and started with small temples like that one that I showed you, Phnom Krom, the 3 towers on top of the hill, gradually got bigger, and then in the end, we have the style of the Bayonne, where the temples aren't so much architecture as sculpture. It's hard to sort of divide the two, with lots of curves and faces being built into the towers. Okay. So I hope that's a basic rundown.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Did Angkor Wat suffer from any unexploded bombs of the Vietnamese War?
As far as anyone knows, there was exactly one incident at Angkor Wat in 71 or 2, I forget the year, where an artillery, a fire base of the Lon Nol government, which was the government in Phnom Penh, fired a number of shells that exploded inside Angkor Wat and killed some people. Part of the history of Angkor Wat that I didn't get into was in the early years of the war, starting in 1970, thousands of people fled into Angkor Wat and lived there for months and months, looking for safety from the war and thinking they would find it, both because of rules of war that you don't shell heritage sites, and also for protection from the very powerful spirits that inhabited Angkor Wat. So when these shells exploded inside Angkor Wat, they killed a number of people who were taking refuge there, and they did some damage to one of those galleries of bas-reliefs. But inside Angkor Wat, as far as I know, nothing else. But around Angkor Wat and around these other temples, cleaning up, discarded munitions has been a huge, huge job. Before these places could be open to tourists, there had to be a very thorough, painstaking survey with mine detectors of all of the area around it to remove anything that had just been discarded there by soldiers over the years, or unexploded bombs that were dropped from the air. But inside Angkor Wat, that hasn't been a problem as far as I know.
Case Smith asked, what about the history of the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge in Siem Reap and whether it impacted Angkor Wat? The whole killing field saga.
Right. Well, people in the Angkor area were rounded up and sent to communes, and there are a couple of places that had been identified actually inside the Angkor Park where the temples are, which were used as execution grounds for apparently soldiers of the previous government or anyone else who was deemed disloyal or a threat or whatever. Interesting thing is that the people who were employed before the war as conservation workers, and there were several thousand of them and their families, they were taken as a group to an area, maybe 20 miles away, and they passed the Khmer Rouge years there, and they were actually treated better than most Cambodians were in those days. Most of them survived, and there has been speculation that the Khmer Rouge intended at some point in the future to take those people back to Angkor and put them back to work, tending the temples, but that never happened.
You may have addressed this earlier. Was Angkor Wat designed to be a temple mountain? And you addressed that, I think, in the mythology.
Yes, it is.
Right?
It is a temple mountain, a mountain temple. And when you go to the top of it, you do feel like you're on top of a mountain. There's quite a view of the countryside around it.
Barbara Steve Spangler asked, have the items taken out of Angkor Wat been returned?
Some have been. In recent years, there have been a number of high-profile returns of major pieces of sculpture from major facilities in this country. The Norton Simon in Pasadena, a couple of auction houses, and these were pieces that were shown to have been looted in the 1970s. And in this whole question of trafficking in artwork, 1970 is an important date because an international convention comes into effect in that point that places pretty tight controls over what can be exported, what can't be. And legally speaking, things that left the country before 1970, it's hard to get back. But things that can be shown to have left the country after 1970 are coming back. But over the years, so much has gone abroad. And some of it through theft, some of it through quote unquote legitimate sales by the French during the colonial period, which is how the Met got its collection. And there hasn't been much pressure to return that material, things that the French sold. But there are private collections all over the world which have Khmer sculpture in them, and nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows that it's in the collection. It's the Khmers were so prolific in their production of artwork that it is literally spread all over the world now. And I should say that as a protection, if you go to Angkor now, the freestanding sculpture that you see is almost all replicas. And the originals have been removed and are in a facility for safekeeping. The bas-reliefs, which you can't remove, are original and real, but freestanding sculpture is almost all replica now.
Gotcha. Regarding going there now, what is the vaccination rate, or is it safe to go there now do you have any sense of that?
Well, they are just reopening, and the policy now is that you can go if you are fully vaccinated and can present evidence of that. And I think you may have to get tests before and then on arrival, but it is possible to get to Angkor now. And Cambodia itself, even though it's one of the poorest countries in the world, has a very high vaccination rate, almost a little over 80%. This is another sign of their connection with China, and that most of those vaccines are Chinese vaccines.
Interesting.
But any foreigner who goes there now is greeted with open arms, in that people are so happy to see people returning. But it, I don't know if the airlines have yet responded to this, how easy it is to actually get a ticket to go. But a few foreigners are going, and what they love about it is you can see the temples now without 10,000 other people being there at the same time, and you can have that magical experience of communing with the stones and feeling like you're one of those early French people who came in and saw the place.
Gotcha. Charlie Hallahan asks, is the cow considered sacred in Angkor as it is in India? And did the caste system ever enter Angkor?
Yes. Well, in today's Cambodian culture, the cow is not sacred in the way it is in India, where cows literally wander the streets and cities with nobody bothering them. But in Angkor, the cow occurs many times in sculpture and bas-relief as Nandi, the mount of the god Shiva. Shiva is associated with this sacred bull named Nandi, and you can go around and find statues of Nandi. The caste system, as we know it from India today, it was one of the things of Indian culture that did not find its way to Cambodia. We don't have this rigid system where people are aware of what caste you're in, and there's very little intermarriage or controls on what occupations you can be in. Cambodia does not have that kind of system.
We're coming to the end, so let me just take a few more questions. It's almost 4:30. Okay. Margaret Hundelt asks, what years were they built, the structures themselves? What is the span?
The span is roughly 900 AD to about 1300 AD. And Angkor Wat was built in the early 1200s. And the Bayonne and the walls of Angkor Thom, the walled cities, and a number of other temples with face towers were all built in the late 1200s, early 1300s.
Okay, good, thank you. It's moving around. Jan McAdoo asks, the plague in their states, the plague in Europe was around the time Angkor, excuse me, was abandoned. Trade from Europe could have brought it to Angkor, causing much of the urban disease, death, and desire to get away. It's just it's a statement.
Yeah. Well, at present, there is no evidence that there was any contact between Europe and Angkor. They were two civilizations that were operating totally unaware of each other. I suppose it's possible that there were people who came from Europe to the Middle East and then to India and India to Southeast Asia, but there's no evidence of direct contact between Europe and Angkor.
Okay.
Until the French came back in the 19th century.
Okay. So some of these I'm going to ask you to just answer quickly because it'd be nice to get to all of them. Are there accommodations for disabilities there at Angkor?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Is it true that there are light and sound shows in Angkor Wat these days? I guess there's no people, so there's no light show.
Yes. I don't know what's happening specifically right now, but over the years, certainly there have been light and sound shows.
How much of the total area has been cleared? Total area, I'm not sure what that means. Cleared
well,
around
almost all of the temples have been cleared, but there's a lot of space in between them, which has not been cleared, which has been left as forest.
Okay. Next comment was Ann Bolster visited there in 1960. She said she noticed that the photo of one of the popular bas-reliefs is greatly degenerated because of the stone rubbing. Is there systems in place to protect it now? The bas-reliefs that get eroded down by people touching them.
Well, they basically don't rub them directly anymore. The rubbings that you buy in Siem Reap they'll tell you that they're made from rubbings from the actual temples, but they're actually made from reproduction bas-reliefs. There isn't the best protection in place for just preventing people from touching the bas-reliefs. You can get very close to them, and the guides will scold you if you touch them. But when there's a great crowd of people in a hallway, how effective can that be?
And the last question here is, Amy makes a statement. The first time I was there was in 1993 when Siem Reap was still very much showing the effects of the war.
Mm-hmm.
This is 93. What was the town itself like before then, and especially during your visit in 69? Yeah, that's it.
It was, a sleepy provincial town of a small number of hotels and a couple of little restaurants. You could walk on the street without getting run over by motorcycles or tuk-tuks. There were, pleasant gardens, pleasant grounds to walk in, but the town suffered grievously in the 70 to 75 war, and then was neglected essentially all the way up until the peace agreement of the early 90s. So they have just completed an enormous rebuilding of streets and sidewalks in Siem Reap. That's been going on for about 18 months. So the walking and driving situation there has been brought up to date. And
last question, I do have one question for you. Did any monks or religious figures live in any of the temples, truly live there?
Yeah. Well, Angkor Wat is unique among all the temples in that it's believed that it was never abandoned, that it was turned into a Buddhist monastery hundreds of years ago. And when the French arrived in the 1860s, there were hundreds of monks living inside at a monastery on the grounds of Angkor Wat. Generally, people do not live inside the temple itself, inside that chamber that I was describing before, or inside those corridors. But there was, within the walls of Angkor Wat, there was an active Buddhist monastery. And all evidence says that Angkor Wat was never completely overgrown and abandoned.
Gotcha. So that's the end of our questions. Clearly, you have a lot of fans here that were very interested. Many probably have visited Angkor Wat. I mentioned to you that we're a well-traveled crowd at Encore Learning. You were just great, John. Thank you. Very, very interesting.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid I can't see any of you, but thank you very much for taking the time to listen.